Welcome to the last in our spring 2020 series of webinars. Today, we're going to be talking about one nation, and you'll notice the question mark. Are we really one nation united? I'm Angela Thurman. I teach economics on the Connect campus.
My name is Rick Sagel. I teach government, Texas and federal at the Trinity River campus.
And I'm Misty Wilson-Mertens. I'm the department chair for social sciences at Connect. And I teach history.
So Misty, what does this quote mean?
So I think there is a feeling right now, if you watch the media or if you read a lot of news, that as never before, we are a divided and polarized nation. That we are not seeing eye to eye, we're not getting along. And you would almost think that there's like violence in the streets, the way that we talk about opposing parties.
So do you agree with this?
I don't, because anytime you talk to a historian and you say, as never before, we're going to start pulling out examples of, well, that's not true.
Okay. Rick, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to kind of agree that the phrase "as never before," that kind of says that this has never happened and we've never been this divided. I mean, certainly we have been more divided. I do think we are divided, more so than we were certainly 20 years ago. But I don't think it's as bad as maybe the media or even our friends may think it is. And that's kind of what we're going to go over.
Okay, great. So what do we have going on here? This looks like a very familiar scene. I think everyone has probably seen either this picture or one very much like it. So this is when we're signing the Declaration of Independence, right?
Right. And so I think we have this idea in our minds that our founding fathers were these men that always got along and they always agreed and they were so polite with each other and they just had this era of decorum that we don't have anymore. Do y'all feel like you've kind of gotten that sense from people?
Yeah, look how they all look so congenial. It looks like they're all kind of in agreement, but are you telling me that that's not the case?
Absolutely. When we gained our independence, only 33% of Americans wanted independence. So that's a minority movement. When we talk about the Constitution, to get it ratified, immediately we'd broke into political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And we're arguing over what does federalism mean? What's the role of states? All of these arguments that we're still having.
Interesting. So you're saying that there was actually maybe a lot of Benedict Arnold types of people.
I'm saying that there wasn't this era of politeness that we think. So I have some quotes I want to read you guys.
Okay.
These are all from John Adams, our second president. And this is him talking about the other founders. So about Ben Franklin, he said, his whole life has been one continued insult to good manners and decency.
Wow.
About Hamilton, he said, that bastard brat of a Scottish peddler, his ambition, his restlessness, and his grandiose schemes come, I'm convinced, from a superabundance of secretions, which he couldn't find enough whores to absorb.
Whoa.
Was that a tweet or was that a statement he issued?
It was before tweets. We actually wrote things on paper.
Before tweets. No, I'm not familiar with that time period, but okay.
About George Washington, he said, Washington is not a scholar, that is certain. He is too illiterate, too unlearned, too unread for his station.
Whoa.
I have a question.
Yes.
Were these statements made like in his like presidential archives, or like when did he make these statements?
These are all in different letters he was writing to different people.
During the time of the independence movement?
And throughout Washington's administration and then right up into his own.
Wow, okay.
You know, he had like 40 years of shade at people.
Didn't know.
Yes, so, these men were not always getting along.
Yeah, these are pretty violent accusations. I mean, these are definite insults.
So moving on to one of our other really contentious eras, we have the Jacksonian period. So Jackson was sort of a force of nature in and of himself. Whether you like him, whether you don't like him, he did a lot to change our country. And some people thought he took the powers of the presidency too far. So this is a cartoon of him being described as King Jackson, and he's ripping up the Constitution and standing on it. There were people in Jackson's era that said he was too stupid to ever have read the Constitution, that he had no idea what was in it. I mean, that should sound kind of familiar, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you think that, I mean, what I'm hearing is that it's possible that the reason that people think that there's so much contention and dissent is maybe because the availability of the press and of Facebook and Instagram and tweeting has made it where you can't not be aware. I mean, would you agree to that?
I don't know if I do, because I think it's not as bad now as it's been previously. So if we can go ahead one more slide. In May of 1856, Representative Preston Brooks from South Carolina jumps on the floor of the Senate and uses his walking cane to attack Senator Charles Sumner because Sumner gave a speech that was pro-abolition and anti-slavery and kind of attacked one of Brooks's family members in this. Brooks beats Sumner so badly, he breaks his walking cane.
Wow.
Sumner is going to spend about 3 months in a hospital. So again, we talk about like, oh, it's never been this bad. We're not beating people on the Senate floor.
We are verbally.
Verbally is different from breaking a solid wooden walking cane over your head.
Yeah, they don't make them like they used to. So that was probably a pretty strong walking cane that he broke.
Yeah, when he was running for re-election, Southerners from all over the country sent him new walking canes. Next time, use mine.
Oh, wow. Well, and it's also interesting that apparently nobody jumped in to help.
Yeah,
no,
the people in the background
so
are cheering.
Stunned. They were just like, what's happening?
Wow. Okay.
I think the best example of us not getting along and fighting as a nation, obviously, is the Civil War.
Yeah.
So, again, I know there have been people in the media saying we're headed towards another civil war. That's very, very unlikely. But we had a point in our history where about 1% of our population died because we couldn't figure out how to get along. And then for a more modern example of us not getting along, I think the Civil Rights era really gives the best example of this. Two sides with completely different ideologies that not just protested, but took it to the streets protesting, and one side reacted with violence.
One thing I noticed in here, sorry to interrupt you, that a lot of this comes from slavery. I mean, even like going back to Adams, it sounds like a lot of the stuff was based on slavery and the Civil War, the abolitionist discussion in the Senate chamber you mentioned. So, and that's kind of interesting that seemed to bring out the most emotions in people.
It's not just slavery. It's also regionalism. It's also religion. There's a lot of things folded on top of each other, so it's hard to tease those threads apart. But for sure, race and the role of racism in our country has brought out several of these moments. Another one we could talk about would be Vietnam, but I didn't put that one in there because I figured most people are probably more familiar with it. I didn't need a picture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about things being divided right now, yes, they're divided. Yes, you maybe disagree with your neighbor, but you're not feeling the need to go burn your neighbor's home down, I don't think.
And I want to continue from what Misty was discussing, and, are we as divided? Are we more divided than we ever have been, right? And I think one way to kind of know whether that's true or not is based on polling data. Now, polls are not 100%. There's always, margins of errors, and one poll will show this, one poll will show that. But I think in general, you can kind of get a trend of what Americans are saying. And let's start with a current event. Let's start with the coronavirus. It is based on what you read in the news and watch on TV, you would think that Americans are just so divided on this. But we really aren't. 77% of Americans say that what the government has done as far as issue stay-at-home orders and social distancing are about right, or even don't go far enough. And this includes 95% of Democrats and 78% of Republicans. So yes, there is a bit of a party difference there. But for the most part, Americans are united behind the government basically telling us what to do and restricting our freedoms like we haven't really seen in our lifetimes. So when you see this news about people going out picketing and protesting, and yeah, those people exist, but they are such a small minority that the media giving them coverage kind of gives them a false sense of power, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be some things related to coronavirus that people are not united about. I think certainly Americans would like to have a timeline. I think Americans would like maybe more clear leadership at the federal level. They might want more leadership at the state level or local level. I think these are all things that Americans might kind of have different opinions on. But this, to me, is kind of the biggest thing you can kind of focus on is, are these restrictions good or bad? And most Americans agree that they're good for now. In 2 months, Americans might be sick of this, but this is something that Americans are pretty clearly united on. Gun control is another issue that I think a lot of Americans say we just can't come to agreement on it. We just can't figure out how to fix it. Well, a lot of Americans, 90% of Americans support background checks on all gun purchases. There are legal ways in most states, including Texas, to get a gun without getting a background check, like a private sale or a gun show. But 96% of Democrats and 83% of Republicans nationwide agree that there should be universal background checks. And this is not the only gun control issue, but this is a major one. And you have 9 out of 10 Americans agree on it. So I think maybe we sometimes focus on what we disagree on. And like what you said earlier, Angie, the media tends to focus on that more so than what we agree on, because that's what gets the news, right? Is what we disagree about.
Exactly. I mean, because I think that people watching this might be surprised to see this, because the way it's always presented is it's just, so one-sided, or it's just, the people that are, for lack of a better term, they'll go, oh, those people are just a bunch of crazy gun-loving, trigger-happy people, and they want people to go out and be killed. And what your evidence is showing is that couldn't be farther from the truth.
I think people have common sense ideas about this, and I think if you ask most Americans, they don't want a bad guy to have a gun. And how to get there is where we disagree about. You don't want mass shootings. You don't want people to use a gun for bad purposes. And there are certainly ways we can do that without maybe infringing on the Second Amendment. And one of those could be universal background checks. Now, why hasn't the government mandated that? Well, because in the government, you have maybe a different, how do I put this? The government that we elect may not represent the government that the people want in some cases. And we can talk about that later or in a different way. But certainly gun control is one of those issues where the government pretends it's much more divisive than that maybe actually is. Even in Texas, people think Texas is a gun-friendly state, and it is. However, similar question, 80% roughly of Texans strongly or somewhat support background checks on all gun purchases. And again, 91% of Democrats and 68% of Republicans. So you can pick a very gun-friendly state and still come away with a very similar outcome. Marijuana. This issue has really changed in the last 10, 15 years. This would have been and what's interesting here is that Americans have kind of moved in motion together. This question 20 years ago, most Americans would have agreed that marijuana should be illegal. But in the last 10, 15 years, it has totally flipped. And now 2/3 of Americans say that marijuana should be legal nationwide. 78% of Democrats and 55% of Republicans agree.
Hey, Rick, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when they say marijuana should be legal, is that recreational use or medical use or both?
I think it includes both. You can find polling data that, no one's going to argue. I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find a poll that shows 2/3 of Americans want recreational marijuana. So that includes recreational and medical. And I didn't put it on the page here, but Texas is actually very similar to this. Texas is one of a few states that still has medical and recreational illegal. And Texans want it to be legalized. Just about these same numbers based on the last poll I showed. So this is one of those issues where America just kind of flipped, and we somehow went from illegal to legal. I don't know why. That's not my job to know why we changed, but the polls do show that we have changed.
Wait, if we can go back there just for 1 second. It's interesting. Sure. In my economics classes, we discuss this as an economic issue, and we actually discuss the pros and cons of legalizing all drugs.
Right. And that, I'm guessing that most Americans would probably be united in not wanting that, right? they'd probably be concerned that legalizing all drugs would be a bad thing. Now, there is an economic reason for it, and I think Portugal might be one of the first countries that has tried doing that, where they basically decriminalized most of their drugs.
And the Netherlands.
Netherlands too, yeah. So that's something that America will probably be later to move to. We're kind of a slower country to adapt to those changes, but yeah, certainly the economic discussion is interesting. I found this one interesting. So whenever I discuss Congress in my class, one of the first things I bring up is, what do Americans think about Congress? And almost consistently, only a quarter of Americans approve of Congress, while about 75% disapprove. And it goes up and down a little bit. The highest approval was ever recorded was after 9/11. And there was a period of time of unity. The country was together. We supported the president. We supported Congress. We thought they were doing a good job. But that lasted like 2 weeks, right? And then we went back down to 50-50, and then we went down below. It was actually 9% a few years ago. 9% of Americans approved of Congress. So we actually are united in our dislike of Congress. And there's several reasons why. I think we don't need to go into those, but we certainly agree that Congress is not doing a good job, and I think it's kind of interesting.
Hey, Rick, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So if so few of us approve of what Congress is doing, why do we keep electing the same people over and over?
I was going to ask the exact same question. Is it everybody, we hate everybody except for my person?
That's probably part of it. And I think a lot of people don't know what Congress is. I hate to put it that way, but I think when you ask somebody on the street, man on the street, hey, do you approve of what Congress is doing? I don't think they really picture who their representative is. They may even think about the president. I don't think most Americans exactly know how those three branches operate, but I do think they associate Congress with the word government, and most Americans tend to dislike government, just the word, and they think the government is ineffective, bureaucratic, they waste money, they tax me, so I think, unfortunately, Congress has been associated with just the word government, and I think it's hard to think positively of government because usually you want to blame them, right? You don't want to give them credit. And I do think it's interesting that we keep reelecting people. Yes, why do we keep reelecting the people we don't like? I have no idea. I don't know. Why do you guys think? I don't really have any good answers for that.
I think it's, what I like to call the easy button. You go in and you just look down and you go, oh, I know that name. I'm going to pick that person. And I think people just look at those familiar names and go, I'm going to vote for that person because I know that name. I mean, what do you think about that? Your government?
Yeah, I mean, there is the power of incumbency, and which goes along with name recognition, right? You vote for the person that you recognize, or you vote on the name that sounds familiar because of yard signs.
Yep.
So there is some probably psychology there, because I mean we're giving the people a big responsibility to vote on something they probably don't know a whole lot about. We vote on judges in Texas. We vote on all sorts of positions that we know nothing about. And I think people want to do the right thing. They want to vote for the right person. But a lot of times what they think is the right person is the person that they know and the person that the name rings a bell. So yeah, any name that they recognize might lead to a vote, which would otherwise maybe we shouldn't vote for the person that you know. Okay, and then my last polling is kind of a funny one, I thought. We are united in that we think we're divided. About 70% of Americans think that we are divided on key issues. This is something that 74% of Democrats and 68% of Republicans agree on. So we agree that we're divided, and I think we could have predicted this, based on what we said earlier. When you watch TV, when you read the news, it's all about the country is divided and we can't get anything done. And it's kind of a cycle. It's kind of a vicious cycle we're in, where we think we're divided. We read stuff that says we're divided. So why do we think we're not divided?
It's interesting here that your partisan split narrowed on this question.
Yeah, it's pretty much
Yeah.
the same with margin of error. Yeah. Yeah, I think there are probably some explanations for this besides the media. I think just social media, the stuff that we tend to follow people on social media or agencies that we already agree with.
So
And
you
so
get
you
stuck
get
in the
this,
echo chamber.
yeah, you get stuck in an echo chamber. And whenever something gets through that echo chamber and you see a post that is like, oh my God, people actually support this or support that. I can't believe it. All my friends think that's a horrible idea. And there's no gray area anymore. It's like left or right. And I think that's a problem. And I think it's not as bad as social media pretends. And also there's the human element. When you have a discussion with somebody face to face, you can kind of give it a little bit of, there's a lot more gray. I'm thinking of the word here. There's a lot more gray area when you're talking to somebody as opposed to writing a comment on a Facebook post or on a tweet.
Keyboard warrior, I think is the word you're looking
for. There you go. That's one. Or like some kind of just, not so certain about everything. And I think social media acts like it's very certain and it's my way or your way's wrong.
So I have another question for you, Rick. So the data you've given us here, the polling data, looks like most Americans are not really left and we're not really right. We're more like center. But if I look at the parties look more left and more right than the people do. How do we explain that?
Oh, I think that's kind of the human element, right? I think the parties, to protect, even the politicians, to protect themselves, they have to identify with that party standing. And the Democrats believe one thing. The Republicans believe another thing. And when you go vote based on party. So I don't blame the politicians. The politicians are really kind of playing the game. And the game is, unfortunately, rigged.
So when we talked about the primary and we talked about parties, we talked about how it's people on either end that are the most likely to go vote. So it's the most polarized, the most divided people that are likely to vote in the most elections. If more of the center voted, would we see politicians move to the center?
I don't know. Maybe if they voted in the primary, but I think when you have a two-party system, you really have two options. And I don't think you're going to get more people voting in the primary because that is specifically for the two parties. And if you're in the center, if you're like, well, I can go either way, why would you vote in the primary? Because you're selecting a party's candidate for that primary.
Well, that's not your actual advice to people, though, right? Your advice is to go vote.
Well, I don't tell people to vote, Misty. I tell people how to vote and how it works. But honestly, I really do not tell people to vote because it is a choice people can make, and I don't think it needs to be a requirement, obviously, for people to do it. But I'm also kind of realistic, and I've had several students who say thank me for like helping them vote, and they also kind of tell me that it was confusing and they didn't know what they were voting for. And this is after they took my class. Maybe I should look in the mirror, right? And I should maybe change my class. But no, they're saying something that I think most people do think is, I don't know, half the people just voted for, and I don't know if I made the right decision. So it's a big responsibility to let people vote, not just in the primary, but in the general. And I guess going back to your question, I mean, I think when you have a two-party system, you're going to have the extremes, no matter who votes in the primary.
So is your solution to this more parties?
That would be, I mean, if that was a solution that would work, then yes. The parties like it, the Democrats and Republicans like having it that way. They like having it either or, and sometimes Democrats are in charge, sometimes Republicans are in charge, but heavens forbid the Libertarians have 5% of the House. That's just not going to happen the way this is set up.
The way like Germany and England do it, where the majority person gets to be the de facto leader, but then they have to form a coalition with representation based on the voting. I mean, I think that would be, that's not what we do, but what do you think about that as a way to form Congress with everyone basically having a seat?
Misty, what do you think about that?
I think given the structure of our Constitution, that's not likely to happen because unlike those other places, we have to throw regionalism on top of everything else. When we set up our Constitution and our Congress, we didn't do it at large. We did it by state. And that goes back to, like Rick was saying earlier, a slavery and free state issue. But we did set it up based on representation by state. So I don't know how you get a libertarian from Alabama and a Green Party from Texas to be in Congress.
I think it's possible. I think the parties are the ones stopping it from happening, not the Constitution. I think that if you have, because if you want to run for president, we had a libertarian on the ballot in 2016 and probably in 2012 and 2008 too. But that libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, was never allowed to be on the debate stage because he wasn't polling above, I forget what it said at, but there's some polling percentage you have to be at in order to get on the debate stage. And he never met that pretty high threshold. So if you, it's kind of unfortunate because if you don't get media coverage, you're never going to be on TV. If you're never on TV, you're never going to get media coverage. So the parties, I think, need to be not broken up, but they need to have not so much control over the media and over the primary system. That's one of the big problems is they get to determine the rules there.
I would agree, because I would argue that even if someone did not have a certain percentage of support, simply having them on that stage at a debate would allow them to bring up questions that were outside of the always asked questions at the typical debate. It's these same questions. And if you have somebody from a different mindset, I think it'd be refreshing. I think it would be interesting. And they do represent a percentage of the population. I think I agree, Rick. I think that we as a nation need to be a lot more inclusive and open-minded about these, what we now consider outliers, because I think that once we hear some of their views, I think a lot of us might identify with those so-called outliers.
So I think the three of us are probably not going to fix Congress, even though I would love us to. So what is our parting advice to our students? How do we get our students to be less polarized and less divided in their thinking? What is something practically our students can do?
Okay, I'll go first. I always tell my students, if you walk away with nothing else from my class, I want you to always question everything. So what that means is do not read a post from some movie star and then go, oh, I believe exactly what they believe. Don't get your beliefs from someone else. Investigate, ask questions, go and see, is that true? Did that really happen? And only then you make your decision. Don't be a sheeple. So that is my advice. Do not follow the herd. Make your own decisions.
That's a pretty good one, Angie. Mine is similar in that when my students, we talk about the media, when I talk about what to watch, what to read, I tell them, make sure you don't just listen to one source or one news agency, or, basically follow news agencies that don't back up your beliefs. You need to have kind of a wide view of what the world is. And if you only hear one side or one portion of a side, you're not going to have a well-rounded view, and you at least need to understand why people disagree with you. Once you understand why they disagree with you, you don't have to agree with them. They shouldn't be able to change your mind, but you have to have, I guess, empathy maybe for the other side. And once you do that, then you'll be able to understand, okay, well, I disagree with them, but I understand their stance. I understand why they think that way. We just have a difference of opinion. And then I think that takes out a lot of the rage and the anger and the kind of confusion as to why how could somebody believe that this is it, So that's what I tell my students.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Misty, what do you think?
So I would say that if we want to have a government that reflects who we are as a nation, more of us need to go vote. Because right now the government does represent those more polarized and politicized ends of the spectrum, where most of us aren't there. Most of us are somewhere in the middle. So I think the more of the center that votes, the more likely politicians are going to move back into the center the way they were in the late 80s, early 90s. Second thing I would say is find an outside news source, find a news source from another country that you like, and read American news through the lens of another country. because that gives you more of a global outlook, a broader perspective, and it's less likely to be as biased one side or the other when they have no dog in the race.
That's a good one too.
Yeah, that's good advice.
All right,
All right.
so now we know the reason all of our students are here, right? They want to get credit for watching this.
No, I thought they just want to learn.
As much as they love to hear us talk, I'm sure this is why they're here. So when this video is posted, it'll be posted on Wednesday about noon. This video description will have a link. Click on that. You have until Friday at, let's say, 5 o'clock to get credit through that. If you look at this video after Friday at 5 o'clock, and that would be Friday, May 1st, then talk to your instructor about how you will get credit for that, or read their announcements, because some of them have probably already told you how you're going to get credit for this. This is our last one of this year, like Professor Thurman said earlier. And over the summer, we'll be designing our next webinar series. So if there's something you guys want to know about, something you want to hear about, obviously we probably will talk about the election at least once. Let us know.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking time out of your day to be here. Stay safe and stay well. And we will talk again, I guess, in the fall for sure.
Yeah, hopefully
Thanks,
back on campus.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.